In today's video, we'll be talking about how you can maybe take an advantage when you have a pawn versus pawn endgame. Usually in chess, pawn versus pawn endgames, when there are only a pawn versus pawn, no queens, no secret rooks, are completely drawn, and a lot of times there's not going to be any way for you to make progress. But there are, like everything in chess, a couple of special cases, and so I'm definitely going to be sharing them with you and making sure that if you land yourself in a special case, you know how to, optimize it for your advantage and hopefully win. So in this position, first, before I talk about maybe a special case where you can win, I'll explain that in this position, the game is drawn because your opponent is an odd number away from you. And what does that mean? That means that your opponent, no matter where you move, can kind of cut you off or essentially stay with you in a 3 or an odd number distance away. So you can see that no matter where you move, your opponent can keep kind of this 3 distance or this 1 distance, depending on how you see it, away from you, and you can't really do anything about it. If instead maybe you try to go to the pawn, same thing happens, and again you can't do anything about it. However, notice that if your opponent makes a mistake and maybe decides instead of keeping this very important kind of position, and instead decides to maybe move to a different square, any square, then you've won, because no longer is this idea where you can't make any progress in the game, and so now you can simply go ahead, cut off your king, capture the pawn, and promote. So you have to know, if your opponent blunders, how to take advantage of it, but for the most part, with reasonable chess, this will be a draw. Let's move on to a position where you can actually win, and there are a couple of important things to note. First of all, the pawns are on the same file. We'll look at a position where the pawns are on maybe opposite files, but if the pawns are on the same files, then there's a couple of things that have to happen. First, for one player to win, that player has to capture the opponent's pawn. And once the opponent's pawn has been captured, the player has to get into what's considered the critical squares of that of their pawn. Okay, so what am I talking about? Well, let's say the pawn was right here. Okay, your white pawn was right here. Well, then the critical squares for this pawn would be these 3 pawns. Okay, because with your king being in one of these 3 pawns, or one of these 3 squares, your pawn can freely promote, and there's nothing that your opponent could do. So as long as your king is in one of the critical squares, then you'll be able to promote your pawn that is on the whatever position the pawn is in. So you have to make sure that you not only capture the pawn, but then also occupy one of the critical squares. And in this position, notice that once you capture the pawn, as long as you do not push the pawn forward, once you capture the pawn, you will be in one of the critical squares of the pawn. But that isn't always the case. If the pawn was here and your opponent's pawn was here, then you'd have to capture the pawn and then either push this pawn forward, or try to move your king down to occupy one of the critical squares. So make sure that first you capture the pawn and then you try to occupy the critical square. Sometimes, like I just mentioned, it will come together. And in this case, you're taking advantage of the fact that you're much closer than your opponent's king is, and that's kind of why you win. Notice also, when your pawns are like this, you definitely want to occupy this square here, and not try to play this idea of coming around, because what happens if you come around, then you're giving your opponent a chance to also come around. When you're here, your opponent has no way to occupy, well, they can occupy these squares, but they can't really occupy the squares that threaten your pawn without going all the way around. And even that, this isn't really threatening your pawn that much. So notice that now, your opponent moves, you capture the pawn, and you're in the critical square, which means that, you've done it, you've won the game. Even if your opponent, is within the square, you won't be able to stop it, and this will be a pretty happy win for you, and you'll obviously be able to promote. Let's move on to a third little position where you're on opposite files, okay? Because here it's slightly different. Rather than you needing to capture the pawn, a lot of times you don't go and capture. Instead, you just want to push. And when do you want to push? You want to push when you have a clear advantage in squares. Okay, so here you can see that, it's going to take you very similar amount of time. Okay, so notice that here you can promote, but then your opponent promotes immediately after you. And so you've actually not gained an advantage. You've simply traded off your pawn for a queen, and your opponent did the same. If your king was on this square, for example, or I don't know, on this square, or somewhere along somewhere where your queen can get forked, or not forked, sorry, pinned, well, your king has to move aside, basically. So, for example, if your king was here, then your queen would be able to go here. Once the king moves, not there, back to where it was, maybe, then you can capture the queen. So, unless this idea where your king is kind of in one of these squares, or even here or something, not there, here, your queen would be able to fork in all of those cases. So unless not fork again, sorry, but unless you're in one of those squares, your opponent has essentially drawn the position. So you can only really push to promote if you have a clear advantage. So if the pawn was here instead, then push. Now your pawn goes here, then you push, then your pawn goes here, then you promote, and now your pawn goes here. Notice your pawn hasn't promoted, and now this is a clear advantage for you. And, I mean, you can even just go here and capture the pawn. You can swing here. You can go here to protect it from promoting. You can even just continue hammering your opponent with checks. It's such a easy position that there isn't one strict rule. You just win. And so if you're in a position that looks kind of like this, where you're kind of in the same level and it's much easier for you to promote, then definitely promote. But what if you're in a position like this, where not only is it not easier for you to promote, the length is much bigger for you, but not only is it not easy for you to promote, it's actually impossible because your opponent is within the square. And I've referenced the square a couple of times. If you don't know what that is, press the little link that's going to pop up right now on your screen. It's a very important concept in chess, endgames, and also just in chess. So your opponent is in the square, which means that you won't be able to freely promote. But also, kind of more than that, you're in your opponent's critical square as well, right? So if we look at your opponent's critical square, you're also in your opponent's critical square. So you'll be able to capture this pawn here. If your king captures this pawn, you'll be able to capture this pawn, and it will be a draw. And you can't really push because like I said, the king will be able to come and stop it. And your opponent can't push because of the same reason. So in a position that looks like this, it will be 100% a draw, because with reasonable chess, of course, because no pawn is in a position where it can promote. Obviously, once again, the little square that I mentioned, no pawns will be able to promote, and it's going to be a pretty nice game for both players because it's just going to end up being a draw. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and leave in the comments a PGN to any special cases that I haven't mentioned, because I definitely couldn't cover everything, obviously, in a short video like this. So definitely leave any special cases that you want to see in the comments, and I'll maybe make another video, a part 2 of this if you enjoy it. Also, I wanted to mention that sometime this week or next week, I'll probably be dropping a second wrap. I made a first wrap, and, it was alright. It wasn't amazing, but it was fine. So I'm probably going to make a second chess wrap, so stay tuned for that by subscribing. And also, if you want more, chess endgame like these, where maybe there's a different position with more pawns, with more queens, with anything, then press the playlist that's going to pop up in the bottom of the screen probably. And it'll take you to a lot of videos where you can learn about chess endgames. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.